I want you to imagine something. Imagine walking out of your front door every single morning, dropping your kids at school, stopping for coffee, going to work, living your ordinary, unremarkable, completely normal life while someone sits in a car across the street and photographs every single thing you do. Every grocery run, every friend you meet for lunch, every late evening at the office, every phone call you take in a parking lot. Every moment of your private, personal existence captured, documented, and delivered in a folder to people who are trying to destroy you. Now imagine finding out about it 6 months later. And imagine that everything in that folder, every photograph, every timestamp, every page of that report, told a story so completely opposite to what they were hoping for that the investigator himself refused to present it the way they wanted. That happened to me. My name is Grace, and this is the story of how my in-laws hired a private investigator to build a case against me and handed me the most powerful weapon I have ever held in my life. I'm 38 years old. I live in Denver, Colorado now, have for about 2 years. Before that, I lived in a suburb outside of Phoenix, Arizona, in a house that was beautiful on the outside and suffocating on the inside. I have 2 daughters, Maya is 9 and Sophie is 7. They are the reason I stayed as long as I did, and they are the reason I finally left. Children have a way of clarifying everything, what you can tolerate, what you cannot, and what you absolutely refuse to let them witness becoming normal. I was married to a man named David for 11 years. David was not a bad man in the traditional sense. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't violent. He was something in some ways more difficult to explain to people. He was completely, totally, and perhaps permanently controlled by his parents.
His mother, Patricia, and his father, Gerald, they were the kind of people who had spent decades building a specific image of their
family, successful, respectable, the right neighborhood, the right church, the right country club. Everything in their world had a correct appearance, and anything that threatened that appearance was treated as a direct attack on their identity. I threatened their appearance from the beginning, not because I did anything wrong, but because I was independent, because I had opinions, because I didn't reshape myself around Patricia's preferences the way everyone else in that family quietly had, because I asked questions instead of simply accepting whatever version of events the family presented. In the Calloway family, that made me dangerous. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have anticipated, was exactly how far they were willing to go to prove it. Before I go any further, I want to stop and connect with you for just a second. If you're watching this right now, please drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read the comments on these videos, and I genuinely want to know who's sitting with me through this story tonight. Because something tells me that some of you know exactly what it feels like to be in a family where you are permanently, quietly, relentlessly on trial. You're not alone in that. Not even close. Okay, let's go back to where this really begins. I met David at 24 through mutual friends at a barbecue in Scottsdale. He was funny and attentive, and genuinely kind in those early years. The kind that feels effortless because it probably was. We dated for 2 years, got engaged, and married in a ceremony that Patricia largely planned because David thought it would make her happy. And I was young enough and in love enough to think that was a reasonable compromise. I should have understood then what compromising with Patricia actually meant. It didn't mean meeting in the middle. It meant starting at her position and working backward until she was satisfied. But I was 26 and optimistic, and I told myself that every family had its friction and we would find our rhythm. We moved into a house 12 minutes from his parents. Patricia's suggestion. David thought it was practical. I thought it was temporary. It was not temporary. Patricia was in our home 3, sometimes 4 times a week. She had opinions about how I kept the kitchen, about how I dressed for church, about how I was raising Maya when Maya arrived, and then Sophie 80 months after that. She never raised her voice. She never said anything that could be clearly labeled as cruel. She operated in that sophisticated register of passive disapproval that is somehow harder to defend against than outright hostility, because when you try to Explain it to someone who wasn't there. It sounds like nothing. She just said the kitchen looked tired. She just mentioned that Sophie seemed fussy. Had I tried a different routine? She just wondered if I was finding time for myself, because I seemed a little overwhelmed. Each individual comment, meaningless. The accumulation of them over 11 years, suffocating. David would listen to my frustrations and then say the thing he always said. That's just how she is, Grace. She means well. She loves you. And Gerald, quiet, composed Gerald, who ran a successful commercial real estate company, would occasionally place a firm hand on David's shoulder and say things like, "Your mother just wants what's best for this family," in a tone that made it clear the conversation was over. I existed in their framework as a variable that needed to be managed. And for years I allowed it because I loved David, and I loved my daughters, and I kept believing that if I was just patient enough, just gracious enough, just steady enough, something would eventually shift. What shifted instead was my marriage. By year 8, David and I were living parallel lives inside the same house. He worked long hours at Gerald's company. Yes, he worked for his father, which tells you everything you need to understand about the power dynamics in that family. He came home tired and distracted. On weekends, he helped his parents with whatever they needed. Holidays were always at their house, always on their terms, always structured around Patricia's preferences. I was raising 2 daughters largely alone, working part-time as a physical therapist, managing the household, attending every school event and doctor's appointment and birthday party, and somehow, still being treated by my in-laws as someone who wasn't quite contributing enough. The Whisper campaign started around year 9. I call it that because that's exactly what it was, whispers. Comments that reached me secondhand through David, concerns that Patricia had apparently expressed to Gerald, that Gerald had apparently shared with David, that David would then bring to me as gentle observations. Mom mentioned she worries that you seem unhappy. She wonders if everything is okay with us. Dad said something about, and I'm just passing this along, whether you've seemed a little distracted lately. He noticed at dinner. Mom asked if you were having any issues with some of the other women at the school. Apparently someone said something to her at church. Someone said something at church. In a community they had lived in for 30 years, where everyone knew the Calloway name and no one would dream of contradicting Patricia directly. I started to feel it everywhere, at school pickup, at church, at the neighborhood events Patricia hosted with her careful smile and her careful guest lists. A slight coolness from people who had previously been warm. A hesitation in conversations that hadn't been there before. I was being managed? Quietly, socially, comprehensively managed. And then one evening in March, David sat me down at the kitchen table with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Uncomfortable, guilty, like a man who had agreed to something he wasn't entirely sure about and was now sitting with the weight of it. He told me that his parents had some concerns about our family situation, that they wanted to make sure everything was stable, that they had decided, as a precaution, to hire someone to, and here he used a phrase that still strikes me as remarkable in its audacity, keep an eye on things. I looked at him for a very long time. What does that mean, David? He couldn't quite meet my eyes. It means they've hired someone to look into things, just to make sure everything is what it appears to be. I sat with that sentence in the silence of my kitchen for what felt like a long time. Then I asked him one question. How long? He looked at the table. About 3 weeks, he said. He was wrong. It had already been closer to 6 weeks by then. And it would continue for another 4.5 months after that conversation. Here is what I did not do in that moment. I did not panic. I did not cry. I did not demand David put an end to it immediately. I did something that I think surprised him completely. I nodded slowly. I said, okay. I stood up, cleared the coffee cups from the table, and I went upstairs and ran a bath. And lying in that bath in the quiet of my bathroom, I thought very carefully about my life. I thought about who I was, how I spent my days, what I did with my time, what anyone following me would find if they looked, genuinely, honestly looked, at the life I was actually living. And I realized something. I had nothing to hide. Not a single thing. Every day of my life was accounted for in the most ordinary, decent, unremarkable way imaginable. I went to work. I picked up my daughters. I visited my friend Carol on Thursdays for coffee. I went to the gym on Tuesday and Friday mornings. I attended the school board meeting once a month because I cared about Maya's school curriculum. I called my mother every Sunday evening. I came home and made dinner and helped with homework and read bedtime stories. That was my life. And the thought that slowly, quietly crystallized in that bathtub was this: if they are watching me, let them watch. Because what they were going to find was not a woman who was unstable or untrustworthy or dangerous. What they were going to find was the most competent, devoted, present mother and person they had ever put under a microscope. And then I thought one step further. What if I made absolutely sure of that? Want to be very clear about something. I did not perform my life for the investigator. I didn't do anything differently than I had always done. I didn't stage anything. I didn't put on a show. I simply became more intentional about the documentation of my own existence. I started keeping a personal journal, dated, time-stamped, detailed, every appointment, every errand, every conversation of significance. Not because I was building a case yet, but because something in me understood that clarity was about to matter. I quietly consulted a family law attorney. I told her everything: the surveillance, the whisper campaign, the social isolation, the years of passive pressure from my in-laws, David's inability to function independently of his parents. She listened carefully, asked precise questions, and told me something that I wrote down and have kept to this day. The surveillance they've conducted is a double-edged sword. If what they find supports their narrative, they use it against you. If what they find contradicts their narrative, it belongs to you. I understood immediately. I requested, through my attorney, that any investigative report compiled about me be considered discoverable material in any future legal proceedings. This was a formal notice. It meant they could not simply discard the report if it didn't say what they wanted. Whatever that report contained was now legally on record. Then I waited. I went to work. I picked up my daughters. I had coffee with Carol on Thursdays. I went to the gym on Tuesday and Friday mornings. I attended the school board meeting. I called my mother on Sundays. I lived my life. And I let them watch every single second of it. The report was completed in month 6. I know what was in it because of what happened next, and because my attorney eventually obtained a full copy during the divorce proceedings that followed. 8 months later, the investigator, a man named Robert Tanner with 20 years of experience, had spent 6 months documenting my life. He had photographs, timestamps, logs of my movements, my meetings, my habits, my routines. He had interviewed neighbors under the guise of casual conversation. He had likely accessed public records and social accounts. And what he had compiled was essentially a character reference. Everyday logs showed a woman who was where she said she was, doing what a devoted mother does. Every interaction documented showed someone who was warm with her children, professional at work, consistent in her friendships, and entirely absent of the instability or deception my in-laws had apparently been hoping to expose. The neighbor interviews had backfired spectacularly. The neighbors, people who actually watched me live my daily life, had described me as reliable, kind, present, and a wonderful mother. One neighbor had apparently volunteered, unprompted, that she had always found my in-laws' treatment of me concerning. Robert Tanner, from what my attorney later pieced together, had delivered the report to Gerald in person, and had told him directly that he could not in good conscience present the report as evidence of anything other than a woman living an admirable life. Gerald had apparently asked him to reframe certain sections. Tanner had refused. He was a professional with a reputation. He wasn't going to fabricate implications that his own evidence didn't support. Gerald paid him and dismissed him. But the report existed, and now my attorney had it. When divorce proceedings began, initiated by me, 8 months after that kitchen table conversation, my in-laws had planned to pursue a custody argument. They intended to position me as unstable, distracted, potentially unfit. They had spent 6 months and considerable money building what they believed would be their foundation. Instead, that foundation became mine. My attorney presented the investigator's report in its entirety during the custody hearing. 6 months of surveillance, hundreds of hours of documentation. Every photograph, every log, every timestamp, all of it submitted as evidence. Evidence of exactly what kind of mother I was. The judge reviewed it carefully. Then she looked over her glasses at Gerald and Patricia, who were sitting in the gallery behind David's attorney, and she said something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She said, "It appears the most compelling character witness in this case was hired by the opposing party. I received primary custody of both daughters. David received visitation on alternating weekends. Patricia and Gerald received no legal standing whatsoever, and a quiet but thorough reputation damage within the very social circle they had spent decades constructing. As word traveled the way word always travels in tight communities, about exactly what they had done and exactly how it had ended, we moved to Denver 4 months after the divorce was finalized. I chose Denver because it had mountains and I had always wanted to live near mountains, and for the first time in 11 years I was making decisions based entirely on what I and my daughters needed without running them through anyone else's approval system first. Maya cried a little when we left the house in Phoenix. Sophie asked if we could get a dog in the new place. I said yes to the dog before we had even found an apartment, which tells you something about who I was becoming. Her name is Biscuit. She is a golden retriever and she is completely ridiculous and we all love her completely. The healing from something like this is not a straight line. I want to be honest with you about that. There were nights in that first year in Denver when I would lie awake and feel the retroactive fear of it. Someone watching me. Someone trying to dismantle the ground I was standing on. The people who were supposed to be my family spending real money to build a case against my character. There is a specific violation in being surveilled. It sits differently than other betrayals. It's the knowledge that your ordinary moments you never thought twice about, were being examined for flaws. That your coffee run and your gym session and your Thursday with Carol were all potential evidence in someone else's argument against you. But here's the thing I come back to every time. They watched me for 6 months. And what they found was me. Just me, doing the work, showing up, being present. Living with integrity in the specific, unglamorous, daily way that integrity actually looks when no one is supposed to be watching. And that is what I am most proud of. Not the outcome in the courtroom. Not the look on Gerald's face when the report was presented. Not any of the external vindication. I am most proud that when someone watched my life for 6 months hoping to find something wrong, there was nothing to find. David and I have managed to build something functional for the sake of our daughters. It is not warm. It is not friendship. But it is civil and consistent, and the girls feel safe within it, which is all I ever wanted. Patricia called me once, about a year after the divorce. She asked about the girls. I answered her questions briefly and politely. At the end of the call, she said, "I hope you know I only ever wanted what was best for David." I said, "I know," and I meant it. She had wanted what was best for David. She simply had never been able to extend that same desire to the woman he had chosen. The family he had built, the life that existed beyond the boundaries of what she could control. That limitation cost her grandchildren who now live 1,200 miles away and see her twice a year at most. That is consequence enough. I am 38 years old. I live in Denver with 2 daughters and a golden retriever and windows that face the mountains every single morning. I work 4 days a week at a practice I love. I have rebuilt friendships that Patricia's whisper campaign had damaged. Because the truth, given enough time and enough evidence, does eventually reach the people who matter. And I think about something my attorney said to me near the end of the proceedings. She said, "The thing about trying to catch an honest person is that all you end up with is proof of their honesty. So if you are living your life with integrity, if you are showing up for your children, doing the work, being present, telling the truth even when it's inconvenient, then know this. You have nothing to fear from anyone's scrutiny. Live so cleanly, so purposefully, so genuinely that the worst thing your enemies can do is watch you. And let them watch. Let them document every coffee run and school pickup and ordinary Thursday. Let them compile every timestamp and photograph and neighbor interview. Because what they will find, What anyone who looks closely enough at a person living honestly will always find is simply the truth. And the truth, in the end, is the most devastating weapon in the room. If this story meant something to you tonight, if it touched something you've been carrying, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have your own story, if you've been watched, doubted, managed, or quietly undermined by people who were supposed to be family, leave it in the comments. Every single story matters, and you are never as alone as they want you to feel.